Welcome to the third webinar. This session, we will talk about experiential learning. After this webinar, the goal will be for the learner to employ Kolb's four-stage learning cycle. By the end of the session, the learner will be able to do the following. 1. Describe Kolb's four-stage learning cycle. 2. Describe Kolb's different learning styles and how each corresponds to different instructional strategies. And 3. Choose an appropriate instructional strategy for each of Kolb's learning cycle for their individual curriculum. This slide introduces a vignette we will be using for the exercises associated with this webinar. Let's redo this. Dr. Frost is a junior faculty member at Big University Medical Center and is scheduled to lead a 90-minute session on types of shock for the MS2 class. This is Dr. Frost's first large group teaching experience, around 60 to 70 students. And he is concerned about creating the best product possible. Having no formal training in teaching methodology, Dr. Frost is planning a 90-minute PowerPoint-based lecture on types of shock. Refer to Part 1 of your discussion sheet. Before we start talking about Kolb's learning cycle, refer to your worksheet and write down a time that you had a poor teaching experience. Reflect on why this was a poor experience. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next section. When poorly received teaching encounters are experienced, a general theme emerges. There is a lack of engagement. This can be from the student or the teacher. The teacher can be disengaged if there is no interest or enthusiasm conveyed for the material at hand. Further, not scheduling activities to engage the student will lose the learner. Additionally, it is important to schedule a diversity of techniques. A lack of diversity can result in poor engagement from the learner audience. Finally, students appreciate being challenged an appropriate amount. Too much or too little can cause the audience to tune out the material as it is no longer relevant. Now consider the opposite of these experiences, a time where you had a great teaching experience. Uniformly, you're engaged in the process. Engagement with learners can occur across a diversity of methods: hands-on experimentation, projects grounded in reality, such as balancing a checkbook, flipping the classroom by assigning homework before the class, etc. Further, in all these circumstances, the teacher was engaged, and whether this was realized or not, likely provided a diversity of techniques. All these factors are key as they all contribute to the experiential part of learning. We cannot talk about experiential learning without discussing the educational theory of constructivism. This theory of learning centers around the idea of constructing one's own knowledge is based on one's own experiences. Knowledge is generated by a meaningful interaction between experiences and ideas. Classically, the cycle begins with having an experience, but learning can begin anywhere on this cycle. After concrete experience comes reflective observation, then abstract conceptualization, to active experimentation, and back to concrete experimentation. We will discuss each step in further detail. The concrete experience is the act of doing. This emphasizes personal involvement with people in everyday situations. The corollary in medical education would be the act of patient care. Medicine is full of concrete experiences. A drug is given with a negative, neutral, or positive outcome. The same with a procedure. Additionally, imaging studies ordered may provide the same negative, neutral, positive impact towards a diagnosis. Further, this occurs for our learners. Certain techniques, methods, and styles work better than others. If you do not have an experience, you can impart an experience. In the beginning of the lecture, we asked you about a good and a bad teaching encounter. You, as a learner, just had an experience by provoking a memory. After concrete experience comes reflection. At this point, the learner reviews or reflects on an experience in order to understand situations from a different point of view. Learners are encouraged to think about prior experiences, how they felt, what was good or bad, and why these experiences may have been good or bad. Reflecting and reviewing allows the learner to explore and debrief the experience, which enhances learning. For example, case-based learning allows the learner to access a prior concrete experience and then reflect on what may have gone well or poorly based on experiences with prior cases. After reflection comes abstract conceptualization. During the stage of abstract conceptualization, the learner is able to learn or draw conclusions from a specific experience. Here is where new information is added to the learning cycle and your prior experience is recontextualized. For example, think about a learner you were teaching presentation skills in the past. What did or didn't go well with your teaching encounter? Why do you feel like this was the case? Now I'm going to give you new information relevant to this scenario. What if I gave you a teaching microskill to help frame your next teaching encounter? Now I've recontextualized the experience by adding new data and skills to your prior construct. At this stage of active experimentation, the learner plans or tries out what they have learned in the past. For example, if you have had a discussion about a prior case with an attending and reflected upon your performance, afterwards the attending may have offered a medical or procedural pearl to your clinical armamentarium. When you choose to use this, then you have performed active experimentation and have also created a new concrete experience. Review Part 1 of your discussion sheet and review Dr. Frost's story. Reflect on which pieces of Kolb's learning cycle are missing from Dr. Frost's curriculum. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next section. Let's recap the first half of the lecture. We've discussed the basic theory of constructivism, which states that learning comes from a meaningful interaction between past experiences and new ideas. Further, learning is viewed as a social construct that is interactive and engaging. Then we discuss Kolb's learning cycle, which classically begins with a concrete experience, then moves on to reflection, then abstract conceptualization, and finally active experimentation, which creates a new concrete experience. Let's move forward and discuss learning styles and strategies within the context of Kolb's learning cycle. This is a perception continuum. On the y-axis, from thinking to feeling, and on the x-axis, there is a processing continuum ranging from doing to watching. Learners are plotted along these axes into 4 categories according to Kolb, each with their preferred method along the cycle. Divergers, on the top right, take experiences and reflect upon them and diverge from a single experience to multiple possibilities in terms of what this experience may mean. This group likes to ask the why question. Assimilators, on the bottom right, have the most cognitive approach, preferring to think than to act. The ask is, what is there I can know? And they prefer to create organized and structured understandings of the material at hand. Convergers, on the bottom left, think about things and then try out their ideas to see if they work in practice. This group likes to ask the how type questions about a situation and prefer to understand how things work in practice. Facts are important, and this group will seek to make careful changes. Accommodators, on the top left, have the most hands-on approach with a strong preference for doing rather than thinking. They like to ask what if and why not to support an action-first philosophy. Routine is not the norm, and this group will take creative risks to see what happens. All these learning groups have instructional strategies that align better or worse for each particular learner. Let's talk about how different strategies enhance different areas of the learning cycle. Remember, the concrete experience is the act of doing. Activities that support this phase are lab work, observations, fieldwork, readings, problem sets, or real-life examples. For example, the purpose of this webinar, the concrete experience, is any experience when you have designed a curriculum or when you have taken part of a curriculum. Activities can be used to stimulate reflection. Activities that stimulate the learner to review or reflect on an experience in order to understand situations from a different point of view are as follows: logs, journals, discussions, brainstorming activities, thought questions, and rhetorical questions. For example, when you are using these exercises for your own curriculum, these activities promote reflection. Remember, the stage of abstract conceptualization is where new information is added to the learning cycle, and your prior experience is recontextualized. Activities that serve this stage are as follows: lectures, papers, projects, model building, or analogies. For example, much of the content of this webinar serves as the abstract conceptualization stage of Kolb's learning cycle. By offering new information on experiential learning, we have recontextualized your prior experiences in building curriculum. Finally, remember, at this stage of active experimentation, the learner plans or tries out what they have learned in the past. You can fulfill this stage by asking the learner to do any of the following: simulations, case studies, laboratory or fieldwork, projects, or homework. We will soon ask you to apply your knowledge of Kolb to Dr. Frost's curriculum, which will have you perform active experimentation and create a new concrete experience. Diversity of approaches is important. It is important that all stages of the learning cycle are touched upon. If you remember, all different learning styles correspond to different stages of the cycle. Thus, a diversity of approaches is key to not only activate all stages of the cycle for optimal learning, but to reach all groups of learners in your cohort. Refer to Part 1 of your discussion sheet and discuss how to modify Dr. Frost's curriculum to incorporate all stages of Kolb's learning cycle, as well as to engage all types of learners. Pause the lecture and take time to complete this portion of the discussion sheet. When you have completed this exercise, please move on to the next slide. Let's recap the last half of the lecture. We discussed two topics: learning types as categorized by Kolb, and instructional activities for each portion of the cycle. We discussed the four different learning types: divergers, who like to ask the why-type questions; assimilators, who like to ask, what is there I can know; convergers, who like to ask the how-type questions; and accommodators, who have a what-if and how-come mentality. Further, we discussed how all these learners plot on different points on the processing and perception continuum, which makes it very important that instructional activities for all parts of the learning cycle be planned. We discussed the diversity of techniques available to ensure that all four stages of the cycle are reached, as well as all four types of learners be engaged. After you've reflected on Part 1 and received feedback on your answers, please think about your own scholarly project in medical education. How does Kolb's learning cycle fit into your curriculum? Are all pieces included in your project? If not, then how can you ensure that the entire continuum is covered? What teaching strategies can you use for this end? Please consider how the material in Webinar 3 applies to your project, and then, using the feedback you have received for Part 1 of the discussion sheet, please complete the Part 2 of the discussion sheet. This concludes Webinar 3 of the Introduction to Curriculum Design and Medical Education Scholarship for Resident Trainees. Please continue on to Webinar 4.